Thank you for inviting me to give a talk over here. It's been phenomenal to come to Kerala, even during the monsoons. So I recently completed my PhD, where I worked on the genetics of autism. And I'd like to share with you some of the research that we've been doing, and where it can potentially lead to in the future. I'm going to try, it can get a bit technical, so I'm going to try and unpack it. So if some of it is quite common knowledge to everyone, I do apologize. So I think one thing that's quite clear from a series of talks we've had over today and yesterday is the tremendous heterogeneity within autism. And this is something that researchers, clinicians, advocacy groups have all been trying to sort of address and figure out how can we sort of identify the underlying heterogeneity, because the needs of autistic people vary. And if we sort of identify these subgroups, then we can have targeted support systems and interventions for those who need interventions. And one way to try and approach this is by using genetics. So a brief introduction onto what autism is. So at the very sort of bare bones level of autism, the latest definition of autism, according to DSM-5, can be construed as two separate domains. One is difficulties in social interactions and communication, and in parallel, a non-social domain, which is unusually repetitive and restrictive interests, patterns of behavior, so on and so forth. But a different way to sort of conceptualize our understanding of autism is to think of it as autistic traits. So we can all imagine that everyone in the general population has got some aspects of the autism phenotype. For most of us, it's subclinical, so we don't need a clinical diagnosis. But this helps us to focus a bit better, or identify patterns a bit better. Some of us might be a bit difficult to sort of, we might find it a bit difficult to socially interact with other people. So we all have different levels of autistic traits. Now, for individuals who have high amount of autistic traits, and if they're in an environment where this is causing undue difficulties, then they may receive an autism diagnosis. So you can imagine these autistic traits as being normally distributed, with the bulk of the people somewhere in the middle, and some people at various extremes. We also know that autism is partly genetic. We've known this since the 1970s. How do we know about it? Well, one of the most straightforward measures of trying to see if something is genetic or not is by looking at twins. So identical twins share 100% of the genetic material. Non-identical twins or dizygotic twins share 50% of genetic material. If one identical twin has an autism diagnosis, then there's a high probability that the other identical twin will also receive an autism diagnosis. That probability decreases with non-identical twins. And the same example, you can sort of extrapolate it to other family members. So there's this massive study from Sweden. I don't know how clear it is. But if you have an individual with an autism diagnosis, the more distantly related you are to that particular individual, the probability of you receiving an autism diagnosis also goes down. So in essence, the more distantly genetically related you are to a person with autism, then the lower the probability that you will receive an autism diagnosis. So you can see that from this dot point, this sort of graph over here, which shows the estimates and the confidence intervals. So we know that between 60 to 90% of the total probability or the variance for developing autism lies in our genes. But how many genes are there that are thought to contribute to autism? We think that between 400 to 1,000 genes are thought to contribute to autism. And this, in my opinion, is a bit of an underestimate. Currently, with high statistical confidence, we have identified approximately 100 of these genes. And to give you some perspective, in the human genome, there are approximately 20,000 genes. So you're talking about a significant fraction of the total number of genes in the human genome, which are thought to be linked to autism. But then, there's no such thing as an autism gene, just like there's no such thing as a gene for language. Genes code for specific proteins, which have specific functions. So, they sort of signal specific things in our body, help our body develop, so on and so forth. What we say when we say we have a gene that's linked to autism is that there are specific genetic variants or the specific alternate forms of these genes which are linked to autism. So you can see in that cartoon over there, you can see that there are these 4 different letters of the genome, T, A, C, and G. And you can see in the top graph, that's the original sequence, whereas in the bottom graph, the T has been changed to C, which is a point mutation in this particular case. So this is an example of a genetic variation. Right. So genetic variants also come in different forms. If you sort of think of the entire DNA in the human body as a recipe book, you sort of coding the information to provide a human being, then you can sort of think of alterations in these recipe books as genetic variations. So if you remove large chapters from this recipe book, you lose a lot of the information. So the ultimate recipe is altered quite a bit. And an example of this in genetic terms is trisomy 21, which leads to Down syndrome. So this has got a massive effect. Almost everyone who has got trisomy 21 has got Down syndrome. But then you can also delete some smaller aspects of the genome. You can delete a single paragraph or a couple of sentences here and there, and these lead to genetic variants with smaller effects. So these are mutations that you find in genes like CHD8 or ADNP, which have all been linked to autism. And then finally, you have the most common type of genetic variations, which are akin to typographical errors. So this is changing a single letter of usually a single letter of the genetic information, and these are known as common variants, or in genetic terms, they are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. And there are many, many common variants. We have the human genome has at least 40 million of these typographical errors. And you can imagine that each single typographical error will not have much of an effect. So if an it is changed to an at, you can still sort of read the sentence and you get the meaning of the sentence. But if you have a whole lot of these typographical errors, then together they can subtly alter the recipe that the book is trying to give you. And so en masse, all these common variants together contributes to many different conditions, including autism. And if you add all these common errors, you get something known as a genetic score. So some people have a lot of these common variants, some people have fewer common variants, but most of us are somewhere in the middle. We have a handful of these. And the people who have a lot of these common variants, which are linked to autism, have a greater genetic probability for receiving an autism diagnosis. And this sort of a distribution mimics the distribution of autistic traits. Right. Right. Now, we know that 60 to 90% of the total probability of receiving an autism diagnosis is due to genetics. But can we sort of divide it even further? Can we say what probability within the 60 to 90% can be attributed to these large effect variants, these common variants, so on and so forth? And there was a study in 2014 that did precisely that. And there have been several other studies since then. But what we know, if you look at the pie chart over there, approximately 50% of the total probability of receiving an autism diagnosis can be attributed to these common genetic variants. This is a slightly old study in genetics, so more recent estimates suggest that anywhere between 30 to 50% of the total probability, or in genetic terms, genetic risk for developing autism can be attributed to common variants. So far, so good. So we know that common genetic variants account for the large chunk of genetic risk for autism. But when we compare to other studies, like studies of schizophrenia, large-scale genetic studies of schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder, we have been really, really poor at identifying common variants. So I'm not sure how much you can make from this graph, but for autism, currently we have identified 5 of these common variants. We know that there are thousands of them out there. Only 5 of these have been identified. Whereas in schizophrenia, it's closer to 200. For depression, which is a very common condition, it's around 50 of these common variants that we have identified. So then the question is, we know autism is heritable. We know that there are these common variants that are linked to autism. Yet why are we struggling so hard to identify common variants linked to autism? So we need to ask, do we need to look at autism slightly differently? What is the rationale of thinking of autism as a single unitary condition? And that is precisely what we have been trying to do. So if you go back at the very bare bones definition of autism in the DSM-5, you can see that there are these two basic domains. That's the social domains, which is linked to social interaction difficulties, social reciprocity, and so on and so forth. And that's the non-social domain, which has things like attention to detail, interest in systems, ability to identify patterns, or repetitive behavior, sensory difficulties, so on and so forth. So far, we have been thinking of these domains as being a part of one common thing. But when you think about it, these domains are quite different. I mean, there's nothing to say that if you have social difficulties, you should also have repetitive behaviors. Psychologically and cognitively, they contribute to very different aspects. So then, can we sort of try and delink these domains? Is there evidence to show that these domains are actually biologically quite different? And there is some evidence. There have been some people who have thought about this. There have been quite a lot of studies which have tried to sort of show that these things are actually separate domains. So one way to look at it is to sort of look at factors underlying the autism phenotype or factors underlying the autistic traits phenotypes. And there have been several studies in several different sample sizes which have tried to sort of see how many factors are there that underlie this. So for all the studies that are there in literature, there's absolutely no single study which has evidence to support a single factor hypothesis that says that both these domains actually contribute to just one single underlying factor. The majority of these studies seem to identify a two-factor model where they draw a distinction between social and communication as being one domain and the repetitive behavior and the restrictive behavior as being a second domain. There are some studies which provide support for a three-factor model, which is similar to what the DSM-4 or the earlier iteration of DSM, thought autism was. These say that there are three different factors. One is social and communication, another is restrictive and repetitive behavior and interest, and the third factor being a play and peer factor. And finally, one single study has provided support for a four-factor model, which says that it's not just two or three, but there are four. But the interesting thing is the most recent and the largest studies seem to suggest that it's actually a two-factor model. So not only do we have a large number of studies pointing towards a two-factor model, but these are actually the largest studies in the largest sample sizes, and these results seem to remain valid whether you're looking at the general population or whether you're looking at autistic individuals. What other evidence do we have? So another way to think about it is to try and measure the social and non-social domains and see how well they are correlated with each other. So this is some evidence that we and other labs have. So recently we managed to measure 4 different measures of autistic traits, so the social autistic traits and non-social autistic traits, from 650,000 people, both from the general population and people who identified as being on the autism spectrum. So we used 4 different measures. We used a measure known as the Autism Spectrum Quotient, which is an overall measure of autistic traits. We used Empathy Quotient, which measures empathy, which is a measure of social autistic traits. And we used 2 measures of non-social autistic traits, so something known as the Systemizing Quotient. So Systemizing is your ability to identify patterns, make sense of sort of disordered information. And we used a Sensory Perception Quotient, which tackles sensory aspects that are important in autism. So what you can see over here, I have the Pearson's correlation between all these 4 different domains. What you can see is that the Autism Spectrum Quotient is correlated to varying extent with all these other measures. So it's got a correlation of minus 0.6 with empathy. It's got approximately 40% correlation with systemizing, and it's got approximately 35% correlation with sensory perception questionnaire. But then what you see is that when you look at empathy, it is not very highly correlated with the 2 non-social measures. So the correlation of empathy, of the empathy quotient with systemizing is negative 0.21, and that of the sensory perception questionnaire is negative 0.15. Whereas the 2 measures that measure the non-social aspects of autism, so the systemizing and the sensory perception questionnaire, seem to be moderately correlated with each other. So again, some sort of evidence from the general population in a very, very large sample size suggesting that the non-social domains are correlated with each other, but the social domains are correlated with each other, but they're not necessarily correlated with each other, with the two domains. And again, I'm not sure how clear those scatter plots are, but you can again take this experiment to autistic people. Can you measure these repetitive behavior, social communication difficulties in autistic individuals and see how well they correlate with each other? And this is a reasonably old work from King's College London where they did exactly that, and they found that the social aspects of autism tended to correlate quite well with each other, and the non-social aspect tended to correlate quite well with each other, but together there was limited correlation. And finally, there's also clinical evidence to suggest that these two difficulties and strengths in these two domains can occur separately. So for example, in DSM-5, there's an entire condition called social pragmatic communication disorder, which has got quite a lot of the social aspects of autism. So you have difficulties in social communication, but you don't have any of the non-social aspects in autism. So you don't have repetitive behavior, you don't have hypersensitivity and things like that. Yesterday I also heard of sensory integration disorder, which I hadn't heard of before, which has got some of the non-social aspects of autism, but doesn't have the social aspects of autism. So this is just one on the sort of evidence pointing towards that. And finally, what you can also do is you can look at twin correlation. So you can measure these two domains in twins, and you can sort of check how much of this is correlated in twins and how much can be attributed to genetics. So your usual twin design, but modified to sort of include correlations as well. And it's a slightly messy slide, but essentially the basic message in the slide is that both these social domains and non-social domains have a significant genetic component to it. So they are significantly, can be explained due to genetics. But the same set of genes don't seem to be explaining the two different domains. It seems to, from twins, when you model it, it seems that there are different sets of genes that explain the social aspects of autism, and there are different sets of genes, an entirely different set of genes which explains the non-social aspect of autism. So far, so good. But then the question is, if we go back, if we look at our DNA, if we look at our genome, can we find molecular genetic evidence to support this hypothesis? So using large-scale genetic studies, can we test this theory? Right. It's a bit difficult to test this theory currently in autistic individuals because we need at least 5,000 different autistic individuals and obtain DNA samples, and we don't have those numbers yet. But we can measure these traits in the general population because we know that they are all sort of normally distributed, and then test this theory using genetic evidence, molecular genetic evidence from the general population. And this is precisely what we did. So what we did is we went about measuring these two different domains in large population cohorts. So, sample sizes between 50,000 individuals to 150,000 individuals. From all these individuals, we obtained their genetic data as well. So most of them, we asked them to spit into a tube, provide a saliva sample, and from the saliva sample, extract the DNA and extract the genetic information. So we had quite a few different measures for the social aspect of autism. So we had a self-report measure of empathy. We had a self-report measure of cognitive empathy. We had self-report measures of how satisfied they are with their family relationship and their friendship relationships. Now, so there have been studies which suggest that autistic individuals, on average, not all of them, on average, autistic individuals have some difficulties in empathy or differences in empathy compared to neurotypical individuals. I want to make it clear that when we say differences in empathy, we don't mean differences in altruism or differences in kindness. We don't have any evidence to suggest that autistic people are unkind or less kind compared to non-autistic people. What we mean is that autistic people have difficulties in understanding, on average, difficulties in understanding what someone else is thinking or feeling. And then once they do understand that, they are able to respond appropriately, but that understanding is a bit difficult. So those were the sort of social aspects of autism that we measured. The non-social aspect of autism we measured using something known as systemizing. So systemizing is essentially the ability to find meaning in sort of incoherent data, so finding patterns in sort of random data. So we all have different aspects of systemizing. Some people are obviously much better at systemizing. Some people are able to sort of recognize patterns in strings of information. Many of these people end up being, coders or mathematicians, so on and so forth. So how did we go about measuring these traits? So as I mentioned, empathy was measured using a self-report measure, the EQ, the empathy quotient. And examples of questions include, people tell me that I went too far in driving home a point. Or I often find it difficult to judge if someone is being rude or polite. So these are examples where they are not able to understand what someone else is thinking or feeling. Systemizing had questions like, I find it easy to grasp how exactly the odds work in betting. Or I can remember large amounts of information about a topic that interests me, examples, flags of the world or airline logos and things like that. And social relationship satisfaction was measured using two specific questions, which is, in general, how satisfied are you with your friendships? And in general, how satisfied are you with your family relationships? And people could report on a scale of 0 to 5, how satisfied they are. For cognitive empathy, we used a measure known as the reading the mind in the eyes test, which some of you might be familiar with. So this measure essentially has got photographs of eye regions that you can see over here. And you have 4 different expressions, which are options that suggest what are the emotions being portrayed in the photograph. So your job is to select the option that you think best describes the emotion being portrayed in the photograph. Some people find it difficult, some people find it easy. So any guesses as to what the first one is? I think your options are playful, comforting, irritated, and bored. That's right, it's playful. Second one, terrified, upset, arrogant, or annoyed. Okay. I don't know. I think it's upset. I'm not very good at this. And the last one, joking, flustered, desire, or convinced. Desire. Yeah, that's right. That's desire. I find that easier. So we used all these different measures. And once we had the genetic data and we ran our genetic analysis, so this particular type of genetic analysis that we run is called GWAS. I'm not going to go into the detail of it. We could do something known as genetic correlations. So genetic correlations are similar to phenotypic correlations, but essentially what genetic correlations tell you is the amount of shared influences. So let's assume you have one condition and another condition, and you're looking at the entire DNA. You're sort of checking how much of the DNA is shared between these conditions. So what fraction of the DNA that contributes to condition A also contributes to condition B. So that's known as genetic correlations. So we looked at genetic correlations between all these different traits and also autism. So the way to interpret this graph is the 0 over here tells you that there is absolutely no genetic correlation, and anything below the 0 tells you there's a significant negative genetic correlation, and anything above 0 tells you there's a positive genetic correlation. Now, what you can see is that systemizing, which is measured using SQ, is positively genetically correlated with autism. Empathy, family relationship satisfaction, and friendship satisfaction are all negatively genetically correlated with autism. And this makes sense because this is what you would expect phenotypically. You would expect that autistic people on average report lower family satisfaction or friendship relationship satisfaction, report lower scores on the empathy quotient and higher scores on the systemizing quotient. We didn't find any significant relationship between cognitive empathy measured using the eyes test and autism. And we have some theories as to why that is, but I'm not going to go into that in this talk. But then these measures were not just genetically correlated with autism. They were also genetically correlated with multiple other conditions, psychiatric and non-psychiatric conditions as well, to varying extents. So this is systemizing, and again, I'm not sure how clear it is, but among psychiatric conditions, systemizing was only genetically correlated with autism, but systemizing was also genetically correlated with different measures of intelligence. So things like years of schooling, how many years of schooling have you had, whether you have completed college, and your cognitive aptitude, so what your IQ points are. And which sort of makes sense, because you can sort of think that those people who are very good systemizers also tend to have very good sort of performance IQ, and might be excellent in certain aspects of intelligence. If you look at social relationship satisfactions over here, so the friendship satisfaction is in blue and the family relationship satisfaction is in red, they are negatively correlated with most of the psychiatric conditions that you test, which again makes sense. You can imagine that people who are depressed or people who have anxiety or schizophrenia, they all report lower friendship satisfaction, and they all on average report lower family relationship satisfaction. And when you look at empathy quotient, you see very interesting patterns. Empathy is significantly positively correlated with schizophrenia, which seems to suggest that people with schizophrenia have higher genetic scores for empathy. It's also significantly positively correlated with anorexia, which again seems to suggest a similar relationship. We are not really sure as to why that is there, and it's something we need to test. Whereas it's significantly negatively correlated with autism, and that's the only psychiatric condition where it's significantly negatively correlated. So again, these different measures that we have measured are all genetically correlated with autism, but they're not genetically correlated just with autism. They're also genetically correlated with other psychiatric conditions and other measures of cognition, so on and so forth. But what we can do is we can look at all these different conditions for which we have genetic information, and we can look at all of them and see which ones of these are genetically correlated with autism, and see if they're genetically correlated with each other. And that is what we did. So we went through hundreds of these different genetic data sets with information on all these different conditions. So we had conditions like ADHD, autism, neuroticism, tiredness, educational attainment, chronotype, which is your sleeping patterns, and all of these. And these are all significantly genetically correlated with autism. And then we thought, how are they genetically correlated with each other? If we sort of cluster them, how do they cluster? What seems to be emerging is that there are 3 different clusters. So at the bottom right, you find a large cluster, which is all these sort of blue dots that are clustered together, where all these different social traits seem to cluster together. So things like empathy or subjective well-being, family satisfaction, friendship satisfaction, they all seem to be genetically similar to each other. The top left-hand corner, you have a cluster which is informed by psychiatric conditions and things like tiredness or depressive symptoms. So things like ADHD, autism, schizophrenia, depressive symptoms, depression, they all seem to cluster together, suggesting that there's sort of shared genetics. Somewhere in the middle, you have 2 different measures of intelligence, so cognitive aptitude and educational attainment, that seems to form a small cluster right in the middle over here. And interestingly, systemizing, which clusters quite closely with these measures of intelligence, is not genetically correlated with any of these measures of social autistic traits. So there is no genetic correlation. It's not significant, and it's not even large between systemizing and empathy or subjective well-being or family satisfaction or friendship satisfaction. And this seems to suggest that at a molecular genetic level, the set of genes which contribute to a non-social autistic trait, which is systemizing, is very different from the sets of genes that contribute to social autistic traits, in this case, empathy or family satisfaction or friendship satisfaction. And this looks very familiar to our twin genetic model. So we seem to be able to provide additional support to what we saw in twins using large-scale genetic study in the general population. And right. Right. Hopefully it'll stay over here. And then we need to ask, is this combination of a significant positive correlation with systemizing and significant negative correlation between the social measures, is this unique to autism? In other words, does this reflect what we know as the diagnostic criteria for autism in DSM-5? So what we did was we sort of tested this theory out with other psychiatric conditions. So we have anorexia, we have anxiety, ADHD, bipolar disorder, depression, OCD, PTSD, and schizophrenia. And you can see that it is only in autism where you find a significant positive genetic correlation with this systemizing and significant negative genetic correlation with these two social domains. So suggesting that this particular combination is pretty unique to autism and seems to sort of mirror the diagnostic criteria for autism according to DSM-5. And the final litmus test is, so we have done all of these in the general population. How relevant is this for autistic individuals? We had some hunch that it would be relevant for autistic individuals because we knew that autistic traits are correlated with autism phenotypes. But what we did was we developed these genetic scores from the social traits, so systemizing, and genetic scores from a combination of these, social traits, which is empathy and friendship satisfaction, and genetic scores from systemizing, which is a non-social trait. And we look to see if this can predict specific aspects of autism in 2,500 autistic individuals. So we measured repetitive behavior and we measured social interaction difficulties in autistic individuals. And from this graph, what you can see is that the score from the social aspect seems to significantly predict the social difficulties in autistic individuals, but not the scores from the systemizing quotient, and vice versa. So the scores from the systemizing quotient significantly predicts the repetitive behaviors in autistic individuals, but not the social difficulties in autistic individuals. So in conclusion, I think it's time to rethink a single genetic explanation for autism. And there's compelling evidence to suggest that autism is not necessarily just a unique entity, and there are different sort of fractionable aspects of autism. There are, we have evidence to suggest that there are at least two broad dissociable factors in autism, one coming from the social aspect of autism and another from the non-social aspect. But there could be other dissociable aspects, for example, sensory difficulties or sleep difficulties. And if you have well-powered genetic scores, we can try and figure out who are the individuals in the spectrum who are more likely to have some of these difficulties. Who are the people who are more likely to, develop social difficulties and as a consequence develop anxiety or depression? Who are the individuals who are more likely to have sleep difficulties or gastrointestinal difficulties? And using this, we can sort of, for those who want it, we can develop specific interventions guided by their genetic scores. And this approach is only possible if we study these traits that are related to autism and phenotype individuals deeply. And with that, there are several people I'd like to thank, loads of collaborators, and thank you to CADRRE for having me over here. Thank you.